The Major, accordingly, persuaded his impatient relative to be resigned, as there was no way of dissipating the thick darkness. And why weary their eyes in scanning the gloomy horizon? He established a kind of encampment in the shelter of the sandhills. The remains of the provisions furnished them a final repast, and then each, following the Major's example, hollowed out a comfortable bed in the sand, and covering himself up to his chin, was soon wrapped in profound repose. Glenarvan watched alone. The wind continued strong, and the ocean still showed the effects of the recent storm. The tumultuous waves broke at the foot of the sandbanks with the noise of thunder. Glenarvan could not convince himself that the Duncan was so near him, but as for supposing that she had not arrived at her appointed rendezvous, it was impossible. For such a ship there were no delays. The storm had certainly been violent, and its fury terrible on the vast expanse of the ocean, but the yacht was a good vessel and her captain an able seaman. She must, therefore, be at her destination. These reflections, however, did not pacify Glenarvan. When heart and reason are at variance, the latter is the weaker power. The Lord of Malcolm Castle seemed to see in the darkness all those whom he loved, his dear Helena, Mary Grant, and the crew of the Duncan. He wandered along the barren coast which the waves covered with phosphorescent bubbles. He looked, he listened, and even thought that he saw a fitful light on the sea. "I am not mistaken," he soliloquized. "I saw a ship's light, the Duncan's. Ah, why cannot my eyes pierce the darkness?" Glenarvan watched alone. He could not convince himself that the Duncan was so near him, but as for supposing that she had not arrived at her appointed rendezvous, it was impossible. For such a ship there were no delays. Then an idea occurred to him. Paganel called himself a nyctalops, he could see in the night. The geographer was sleeping like a mole in his bed, when a strong hand dragged him from his sandy couch. "Who is that?" cried he. "I." "Who?" "Glenarvan, come, I need your eyes." "My eyes," replied Paganel, rubbing them vigorously. "Yes, your eyes, to distinguish the Duncan in this darkness. Come." "And why my eyes?" said Paganel to himself, delighted, nevertheless, to be of service to Glenarvan. He rose, shaking his torpid limbs in the manner of one awakened from sleep, and followed his friend along the shore. Glenarvan requested him to survey the dark horizon to seaward. For several moments Paganel conscientiously devoted himself to this task. "Well, do you perceive nothing?" asked Glenarvan. "Nothing, not even a cat could see 2 paces before her." "Look for a red or a green light, on the starboard or the larboard side." "I see neither a red nor a green light. All is darkness," replied Paganel, whose eyes were thereupon involuntarily closed. For half an hour he mechanically followed his impatient friend in absolute silence, with his head bowed upon his breast, sometimes raising it suddenly. He tottered along with uncertain steps, like those of a drunken man. At last Glenarvan, seeing that the geographer was in a state of somnambulism, took him by the arm, and without waking him, led him back to his sandhole, and comfortably deposited him therein. At break of day, they were all started to their feet by the cry, "Impatience! The Duncan, the Duncan!" "Hurrah, hurrah!" replied Glenarvan's companions, rushing to the shore. The Duncan was indeed in sight. 5 miles distant, the yacht was sailing under low pressure, her mainsails carefully reefed, while her smoke mingled with the mists of the morning. The sea was high, and a vessel of her tonnage could not approach the shore without danger. Glenarvan, provided with Paganel's telescope, watched the movements of the Duncan. Captain Mangles could not have perceived them, for he did not approach, but continued to coast along with only a reefed topsail. At this moment Thalcave, having loaded his carbine heavily, fired it in the direction of the yacht. They gazed and listened. 3 times the Indian's gun resounded, waking the echoes of the shore. At last, a white smoke issued from the side of the yacht. "They see us," cried Glenarvan. "It is the Duncan's cannon." A few moments after, a heavy report rang out on the air, and the Duncan, shifting her sail and putting on steam, was seen to be approaching the shore. By the aid of the glass they saw a boat leave the ship's side. "Lady Helena cannot come," said Tom Austin. "The sea is too rough." "Nor Captain Mangles," replied MacNab. "He cannot leave his vessel." My sister," cried Robert, stretching his arms towards the yacht which rolled heavily. "I hope I shall soon get on board," exclaimed Glenarvan. "Patience, Edward, you will be there in 2 hours," replied Mac Nab. Glenarvan now joined Thalcave, who, standing with folded arms alongside of Thayuka, was calmly gazing at the waves. Glenarvan took his hand, and pointing to the yacht said, "Come." The Indian shook his head. "Come, my friend," continued Glenarvan. "No," replied Thalcave gently. "Here is Thayuka, and there are the Pampas," he added, indicating with a sweep of his hand the vast expanse of the plains. It was clear that the Indian would never leave the prairies, where the bones of his fathers whitened. Glenarvan knew the strong attachment of these children of the desert to their native country. He therefore shook Thalcave's hand and did not insist, not even when the Indian, smiling in his peculiar way, refused the price of his services, saying, "It was done out of friendship." His lordship, however, desired to give the brave Indian something which might at least serve as a souvenir of his European friends. But what had he left? His arms, his horses, everything had been lost in the inundation. His friends were no richer than himself. For some moments, he was at a loss how to repay the disinterested generosity of the brave guide. But at last, a happy idea occurred to him. He drew from his pocketbook a costly medallion enclosing an admirable portrait, one of Lawrence's masterpieces, and presented it to Thalcave. "My wife," said Glenarvan. Thalcave gazed with wonder at the portrait, and pronounced these simple words, "Good and beautiful." Then Robert, Paganel, the Major, Tom Austin, and the 2 sailors bade an affectionate adieu to the noble Patagonian, who clasped each one in succession to his broad breast. All were sincerely sorry at parting with so courageous and devoted a friend. Paganel forced him to accept a map of South America and the 2 oceans, which the Indian had frequently examined with interest. It was the geographer's most precious possession. As for Robert, he had nothing to give but caresses, which he freely lavished upon his deliverer and upon Thayuka. They pushed off, and the boat was rapidly borne from the shore by the ebbing tide. For a long time, the motionless outline of the Indian was seen through the foam of the waves. At that instant, the Duncan's boat approached, and gliding into the narrow channel between the sandbanks, grounded on the beach. "My wife?" asked Glenarvan. "My sister," cried Robert. "Lady Helena and Miss Grant await you on board," replied the coxswain. "But we have not a moment to lose, my lord, for the tide is beginning to ebb." The last acknowledgments were given, and Thalcave accompanied his friends to the boat. Just as Robert was about to embark, the Indian took him in his arms and gazed at him tenderly. "Now go," said he, "you are a man." "Adieu, my friend, adieu," cried Glenarvan. "Shall we ever see each other again?" asked Paganel. "Who knows?" replied Thalcave, raising his arms towards heaven. They pushed off, and the boat was rapidly borne from the shore by the ebbing tide. For a long time the motionless outline of the Indian was seen through the foam of the waves. Then his tall form grew indistinct, and soon became invisible. An hour afterwards they reached the Duncan. Robert was the first to spring upon the deck, where he threw himself upon his sister's neck, while the crew of the yacht filled the air with their joyous shouts. Thus had our travelers accomplished the journey across South America on a rigorously straight line. Neither mountains nor rivers had turned them aside from their course, and although they were not forced to struggle against the evil designs of men, the relentless fury of the elements had often tested their generous intrepidity to its utmost powers of endurance. Chapter 27. A New Destination. The first moments were consecrated to the happiness of meeting. Lord Glenarvan did not wish the joy in the hearts of his friends to be chilled by tidings of their want of success. His first words, therefore, were, "Courage, my friends, courage. Captain Grant is not with us, but we are sure to find him." It needed only such an assurance to restore hope to the passengers of the Duncan. Lady Helena and Mary Grant, while the boat was approaching the ship, had experienced all the anguish of suspense. From the deck, they endeavored to count those who were returning. At one time the young girl would despair, at another she would think she saw her father. Her heart beat quickly, she could not speak, she could scarcely stand. Lady Helena supported her, while Captain Mangles stood beside her in silence. His keen eyes, accustomed to distinguish distant objects, could not discern the captain. "He is there, he is coming, my father," murmured the young girl. But as the boat gradually drew near, the illusion vanished. Not only Lady Helena and the captain, but Mary Grant, had now lost all hope. It was, therefore, time for Glenarvan to utter his assuring words. Breakfast. After the first embraces, all were informed of the principal incidents of the journey, and, first of all, Glenarvan made known the new interpretation of the document, due to the sagacity of Jacques Paganel. He also praised Robert, of whom his sister had a right to be proud. His courage, his devotion, and the dangers that he had overcome were conspicuously set forth by his noble friend, so that the boy would not have known where to hide himself if his sister's arms had not afforded him a sure refuge. Lady Helena and Mary Grant, while the boat was approaching the ship, had experienced all the anguish of suspense. From the deck they endeavored to count those who were returning. "You need not blush, Robert," said Captain Mangles. "You have behaved like the worthy son of Captain Grant." He stretched out his arms towards Mary's brother, and pressed his lips to the boy's cheeks, which were still wet with tears. They then spoke of the generous Thalcave. Lady Helena regretted that she could not have shaken hands with the brave Indian. Mac Nab, after the first outbursts of enthusiasm, repaired to his cabin to shave himself. As for Paganel, he flitted hither and thither, like a bee, extracting the honey of compliments and smiles. He wished to embrace all on board the Duncan, and beginning with Lady Helena and Mary Grant, ended with Mr. Albinett, the steward, who could not better recognize such politeness than by announcing breakfast. "Breakfast," cried Paganel. "Yes, Mr. Paganel," replied Albinett. "A real breakfast, on a real table, with tablecloth and napkins." "Certainly." "And shall we not eat hard eggs or ostrich steaks?" "Oh, Mr. Paganel," replied the worthy steward, greatly embarrassed. "I did not mean to offend you, my friend," said the geographer, "but for a month our food has been of that sort, and we have dined, not at a table, but stretched on the ground, except when we were astride of the trees. This breakfast that you have just announced seemed to me, therefore, like a dream, a fiction, a chimera." "Well, we will test its reality, Monsieur Paganel," replied Lady Helena, who could not help laughing. "Accept my arm," said the gallant geographer. "Has your lordship any orders to give?" inquired Captain Mangles. "After breakfast, my dear fellow," replied Glenarvan, "we will discuss in council the program of the new expedition." The passengers and the young captain then descended to the cabin. Orders were given to the engineer to keep up steam, that they might start at the first signal. The major and the travelers, after a rapid toilette, seated themselves at the table. Ample justice was done to Mr. Albinett's repast, which was declared excellent and even superior to the splendid banquets of the Pampas. Paganel called twice for every dish, through absent-mindedness, as he said. This unfortunate word led Lady Helena to inquire if the amiable Frenchman had occasionally shown his habitual failing. The Major and Lord Glenarvan looked at each other with a smile. As for Paganel, he laughed heartily, and promised, upon his honor, not to commit a single blunder during the entire voyage. He then, in a very comical way, told the story of his mistake in the study of Spanish. "After all," he added in conclusion, "misfortunes are sometimes beneficial, and I do not regret my error." "And why, my worthy friend?" asked the Major. "Because I not only know Spanish but Portuguese also. I speak 2 languages instead of 1. "By my faith, I should not have thought of that," replied Mac Nab. "My compliments, Paganel, my sincere compliments." Table talk in the South Atlantic. Paganel was applauded, but did not lose a single mouthful. He did not, however, notice one peculiarity observed by Glenarvan, and that was the young captain's attentions to his neighbor, Mary Grant. A slight sign from Lady Helena to her husband told him how matters stood. He gazed at the 2 young people with affectionate sympathy, and finally addressed the captain, but upon a different subject. "How did you succeed with your voyage, Captain?" he inquired. "Excellently," replied the captain. "Only I must inform your lordship that we did not return by way of the Strait of Magellan." "What?" cried Paganel. "You doubled Cape Horn and I was not there." "Hang yourself," said the Major. "Selfish fellow, you give me this advice in order that you may share my rope," retorted the geographer. "Well, my dear Paganel," added Glenarvan, "unless we are endowed with ubiquity, we cannot be everywhere. Since you crossed the Pampas, you could not at the same time double Cape Horn." "Nevertheless, I am sorry," replied the geographer. Captain Mangles now told the story of his voyage, and was congratulated by Glenarvan, who, addressing Mary Grant, said, "My dear young lady, I see that Captain John pays his homage to your noble qualities, and I am happy to find that you are not displeased with his ship." "Oh, how could I be?" replied Mary, gazing at Lady Helena, and perhaps also at the young captain. "My sister loves you, Mr. Captain," cried Robert, "and I do too." "And I return your love, my dear boy," replied Captain Mangles, a little confused by Robert's words, which also brought a slight blush to the face of the young girl. Then, changing the conversation to a less embarrassing subject, the captain added, "Since I have related the Duncan's voyage, will not your lordship give us a few particulars of your travels and the exploits of our young hero?" No recital could have been more agreeable to Lady Helena and Miss Grant, and Glenarvan hastened to satisfy their curiosity. He told, word for word, all about their journey from ocean to ocean, the passage of the Andes, the earthquake, Robert's disappearance, his capture by the condor, Thalcave's fortunate shot, the adventure with the wolves, the boy's devotion, the meeting with Sergeant Manuel, the inundation, their refuge in the tree, the lightning, the fire, the alligators, the waterspout, the night on the shores of the Atlantic. All these incidents, cheerful or serious, excited alternately the joy and terror of his hearers. Many a circumstance was related that brought Robert the caresses of his sister and Lady Helena. Never was boy more highly praised, or by more enthusiastic friends. "Now, my friends," remarked Lord Glenarvan when he had finished his recital, "let us think of the present. Let us return to the subject of Captain Grant." When breakfast was over, the party repaired to Lady Helena's stateroom, and, taking seats around a table loaded with maps and charts, resumed the conversation. Glenarvan explained that the shipwreck had not taken place on the shores either of the Pacific or the Atlantic, and that, consequently, the document had been wrongly interpreted so far as Patagonia was concerned, that Paganel, by a sudden inspiration, had discovered the mistake and proved that they had been following a false trail. The geographer was accordingly asked to explain the French document, which he did to the satisfaction of every one. When he had finished his demonstration, Glenarvan announced that the Duncan would immediately set sail for Australia. The Major, however, before the order was given, asked permission to make a single remark. "Speak, Major," said Glenarvan. "My object," said MacNab, "is not to invalidate the arguments of my friend Paganel, still less to refute them. I consider them rational, sagacious, and worthy of our whole attention, but I desire to submit them to a final examination, that their validity may be incontestable." "My object," said MacNab, "is not to invalidate the arguments of my friend Paganel, still less to refute them." No one knew what the prudent MacNab meant, and his hearers listened with some anxiety. "Go on, Major," said Paganel. "I am ready to answer all your questions." "Nothing can be simpler," said the Major. 5 months ago, in the Frith of Clyde, when we studied the 3 documents, their interpretation seemed clear to us. No place but the western coast of Patagonia could, we thought, have been the scene of the shipwreck. We had not even the shadow of a doubt on the subject. "Very true," added Glenarvan. "Afterwards," resumed the Major, "when Paganel, in a moment of providential absent-mindedness, embarked on board our vessel, the documents were submitted to him, and he unhesitatingly sanctioned our search upon the American coast." "You are right," observed the geographer. "And nevertheless, we are mistaken," said the Major. "Yes, we are mistaken," repeated Paganel. "But to be mistaken is only to be human, while it is the part of a madman to persist in his error." "Wait, Paganel," continued the Major. "Do not get excited. I do not mean that our search ought to be prolonged in America." "What do you ask, then?" inquired Glenarvan. "Simply the acknowledgement that Australia now seems to be the scene of the Britannia's shipwreck, as much as South America did before." "Granted," replied Paganel. "Who knows, then," resumed the Major, "whether, after Australia, another country may not offer us the same probabilities, and whether, when this new search proves vain, it may not seem evident that we ought to have searched elsewhere." Friends in council. Glenarvan and Paganel glanced at each other. The Major's remarks were strictly correct. "I desire, therefore," added MacNab, "that a final test be made before we start for Australia. Here are the documents and maps. Let us examine successively all points that the 37th parallel crosses, and see if there is not some other country to which the document has as precise a reference. Nothing is easier, replied Paganel. The map was placed before Lady Helena, and all showed themselves ready to follow Paganel's demonstration. After carefully examining the documents, it was unanimously agreed that Paganel's interpretation was the correct one. I leave you, therefore, my friends, said he, in conclusion, to decide whether all the probabilities are not in favor of the Australian continent. Evidently, replied the passengers and the captain with unanimity. Captain, said Glenarvan, have you sufficient provisions and coal? Yes, my lord, I procured ample supplies at Talcahuano, and besides, we can lay in a fresh stock of fuel at Cape Town. One more remark, said the major. 1,000, if you please. Whatever may be the guarantees for success in Australia, will it not be well to call for a day or two, in passing, at the islets of Tristan da Cunha and Amsterdam? They are situated so near our strict line of search, that it is worth our while to ascertain if there be on them any trace of the shipwreck of the Britannia. The unbeliever, said Paganel. I do not want to have to return to them, monsieur, if Australia does not after all realize our newly conceived expectations. The precaution is not a bad one, said Glenarvan. At sunrise they saw the conical peak of Tristan, seemingly separated from all the rest of the rocky group. A few hours of their united toil resulted in the death of a large number of seals who were caught napping. And I do not wish to dissuade you, quite the contrary, replied the geographer. Well then, we will adopt it and start forthwith, said Lord Glenarvan. Immediately, my lord, replied the captain, as he went on deck, while Robert and Mary Grant uttered the liveliest expressions of gratitude, and the Duncan, leaving the American coast and heading to the east, was soon swiftly plowing the waves of the Atlantic. Chapter 28. Tristan da Cunha and the Isle of Amsterdam. Looking aloft. The Duncan now had before her a broad stretch of ocean, but little traversed by navigators. Between the shores of South America and the little speck in the ocean known by the name of Tristan da Cunha, there was no probability of her meeting with any strange sail, and under some circumstances, or in some company, the days might have been monotonous, and the hours might have hung wearily. But so ardent was the desire for success, and so accomplished, yet varied, were the characters of those who composed the little assembly, that the voyage on the South Atlantic, though devoid of striking incident, was by no means wanting in interest. Much of the time was spent on deck, where the ladies' cabins were now located, Mary Grant especially training her hand, head, and heart in feeling, thought, and action. The geographer set to work on a composition entitled Travels of a Geographer on the Argentine Pampas, but many a blank page did he leave. Though Scottish peer, when tired of examining for the 1,000th time all that belonged to his yacht, could look at the books and documents which he had brought with him, intending to peruse them carefully. And as to the major, he was never in company and never out of company. His cigar ensured, nothing else was wanted. Ever and anon many miles of the ocean would be covered by masses of seaweed. These different species of algae would afford subject for research. Specimens must be preserved, authorities must be consulted, and as one result at least all would become wiser. Then a discussion would ensue on some geographical problem, and maps that were not attainable were of course appealed to by each disputant, though the subject in question was often of very trivial moment. It was in the midst of a debate of this kind, during the evening, that a sailor cried out, "Land ahead." "In what direction?" asked Paganel. "To windward," replied the sailor. The landsman's eyes were strained, but to no purpose. The geographer's telescope was brought into requisition, but with no avail. "I do not see the land," said its owner. "Look into the clouds," said the captain. "Ah," replied Paganel, struck with the idea, and shortly with the reality also, for there was the barren mountain-top of Tristan da Cunha. "Then," said he, "if I remember aright, we are 80 miles from it. Is not that the distance from which this mountain is visible?" "Exactly so," replied the captain. A few hours brought them much nearer to the group of high and steep rocks, and at sunrise they saw the conical peak of Tristan, seemingly separated from all the rest of the rocky group, and reflecting the glory of the blue heavens and of the rising orb on the placid sea at its base. Our friends found a few voluntary exiles on the former island, who, by means of seal fishing, eke out a scanty existence in this out-of-the-way spot. Inasmuch as this was sufficient to cook fish, Paganel decided that it was not necessary for him to bathe here, geographically. There are 3 islets in this group, Tristan da Cunha, Inaccessible, and Rossignol, but it was only at the first of these that the Duncan called. Inquiry was made of the authorities, for these islets are governed by a British official from the Cape of Good Hope, if there were any tidings of the Britannia, but nothing was known of such a ship. They were told of the shipwrecks which had occurred, but there was nothing that afforded a clue to that which they sought. They spent some hours in examination of the fauna and flora, which were not very extensive. They saw and were seen by the sparse population that subsist here, and in the afternoon of the same day, the yacht left the islands and islanders so rarely visited. Whilst the passengers had been thus engaged, Lord Glenarvan had allowed his crew to employ their time advantageously to themselves in capturing some of the seals which are so plentiful in these latitudes. A few hours of their united toil resulted in the death of a large number of seals who were caught napping, and in the stowing away, for the profit of the crew when they should reach the Australian market, several barrels of the oil obtained from their carcasses. Still onward on the same parallel lay the course of the Duncan, towards the Isles of Amsterdam and St. Paul, and the same subjects of conversation, study, and speculation engaged them all, until one morning, they espied the first-mentioned island, far ahead. And as they drew nearer, a peak rose clearly before their vision, which strongly reminded them of the Peak of Tenerife they had beheld a few months before. Warm springs and warm talk. The Isle of Amsterdam or St. Peter and the Isle of St. Paul have been visited by very few, and but little is known of them. The latter is uninhabited, but our friends found a few voluntary exiles on the former island, who, by means of seal fishing, eke out a scanty existence in this out-of-the-way spot. Here again inquiry was made, but in vain, for any information of the Britannia, her voyage, or her shipwreck. Neither on the Isle of Amsterdam nor on that of St. Paul, which the whalers and seal fishers sometimes visit, had there been any trace of the catastrophe. Desolate as these lonely islands appeared to our travelers, they still were not devoid of objects of interest. They were meager enough in vegetation and in animal life, but there were warm springs which well repaid a visit. Captain Mangles found the temperature of their waters to be 166 degrees Fahrenheit, and inasmuch as this was sufficient to cook fish, Paganel decided that it was not necessary for him to bathe here, geographically. When they resumed their course, though many miles were before them, there was a growing sense of anticipation. They were not to pause again until the Australian continent was reached, and more did the conversation and discussions tend towards this continent as their subject. On one occasion, so certain was Paganel as to the ease with which they would be able to pursue their search, when they arrived, that he asserted that more than 50 geographers had already made the course clear for them. "What 50 do you say?" asked the Major with an air of doubt. "Yes, MacNab, decidedly," said the geographer, piqued at the hesitancy to believe him. "Impossible," replied the Major. "Not at all, and if you doubt my veracity, I will cite their names." "Ah," said the Major quietly, "you clever people stick at nothing." "Major," said Paganel, "will you wager your rifle against my telescope that I cannot name at least 50 Australian explorers?" "Of course, Paganel, if you like," replied MacNab, seeing that he could not now recede from his position without incurring the ridicule of the company. "Major," said Paganel, "will you wager your rifle against my telescope that I cannot name at least 50 Australian explorers?" "Master Robert shall count for us." And forthwith, the learned geographer opened his budget and poured forth the history of the discovery of Australia. "Well then," said Paganel to Lady Helena and Miss Grant, "come and be umpires, and Master Robert shall count for us." And forthwith, the learned geographer opened his budget and poured forth the history of the discovery of Australia, with the names of its discoverers and the dates of their explorations, as fluently as though his sole calling in life was to be professor of Australian history. Rapidly he mentioned the first 20 who found or traversed the austral shores, as rapidly did the names of the second score flow from his lips, and after the prescribed 50 had been enumerated, he kept on as though his list were inexhaustible. "Enough, Monsieur Paganel," said Lady Helena. "You have shown that there is nothing, great or small, about Australia of which you are ignorant." "Nay, madam," said the geographer with a bow. Then, with a peculiar expression, he smiled as he said to the major, "We will talk about the rifle at another time." Chapter 29. The Storm on the Indian Ocean. 2 days after this conversation, Captain Mangles took an observation, and the passengers saw, to their great satisfaction, upon consulting the map, that they were in the vicinity of Cape Bernouilli, which they might expect to reach in 4 days. The west wind had hitherto favored the progress of the yacht, but for several days it had shown a tendency to fail, and now there was a perfect calm. The sails flapped idly against the masts, and had it not been for her powerful screw, the Duncan would have been becalmed on the ocean. Forebodings of disaster. This state of things might be prolonged indefinitely. At evening, Glenarvan consulted the captain on the subject. The latter, whose supply of coal was rapidly diminishing, appeared much disturbed at the subsidence of the wind. He had covered his ship with canvas and set his studding and mainsails that he might take advantage of the least breeze, but in nautical language, there was not enough wind to fill a hat. "At all events," said Glenarvan, "we need not complain. It is better to be without wind than to have a contrary one." "Your lordship is right," replied Captain Mangles, "but I dread some sudden change in the weather. We are now in the neighborhood of the trade winds, which, from October to April, blow from the northeast, and our progress will, therefore, be very much retarded." "But what can we do, Captain? If this misfortune occurs, we must submit to it. It will only be a delay, after all." "Probably, if a storm does not come upon us too." "Do you fear bad weather?" asked Glenarvan, looking at the sky, which, however, was cloudless. "Yes," replied the captain. "I tell your lordship, but would conceal my apprehensions from Lady Helena and Miss Grant." "You act wisely. What do you apprehend?" "There are signs of a great storm. Do not trust the appearance of the sky, my lord. Nothing is more deceptive. For 2 days the barometer has fallen to an alarming degree. This is a warning that I cannot disregard. I particularly fear the storms of the South Seas, for I have been already exposed to them." "John," replied Glenarvan, "the Duncan is a stout vessel, and her captain a skillful seaman. Let the storm come, we will take care of ourselves." Captain Mangles, while giving expression to his fears, was by no means forgetful of his duty as a sailor. The steady fall of the barometer caused him to take every measure of precaution. The sky, as yet, gave no indication of the approaching tempest, but the warnings of his infallible instrument were not to be disregarded. The young captain accordingly remained on deck all night. About 11 o'clock the sky grew threatening towards the south. All hands were immediately called on deck to take in the sails. At midnight the wind freshened. The creaking of the masts, the rattling of the rigging, and the groaning of bulkheads informed the passengers of the state of affairs. Paganel, Glenarvan, the major, and Robert came on deck to render assistance if it should be needed. Over the sky, that they had left clear and studded with stars, now rolled thick clouds broken by light bands and spotted like the skin of a leopard. "Has the storm broken upon us?" asked Glenarvan. "Not yet, but it will presently," replied the captain. At that moment he gave the order to reef the topsail. The sailors sprang into the windward rattlings, and with difficulty accomplished their task. Captain Mangles wished to keep on as much sail as possible, to support the yacht and moderate her rolling. After these precautions had been taken, he told the mate and the boatswain to prepare for the assault of the tempest, which could not be long in breaking forth. Still, like an officer at the storming of a breach, he did not leave the point of observation, but from the upper deck endeavored to draw from the stormy sky its secrets. An added calamity. It was now 1 o'clock in the morning. Lady Helena and Miss Grant, aroused by the unusual bustle, ventured to come on deck. The wind was sharply whistling through the cordage, which, like the strings of a musical instrument, resounded as if some mighty bow had caused their rapid vibrations. The pulleys clashed against each other, the ropes creaked with a sharp sound in their rough sockets, the sails cracked like cannon, and vast waves rolled up to assail the yacht, as it lightly danced on their foaming crests. When the captain perceived the ladies, he approached and besought them to return to the cabin. Several waves had already been shipped, and the deck might be swept at any moment. The din of the elements was now so piercing that Lady Helena could scarcely hear the young captain. "Is there any danger?" she managed to ask him during a momentary lull in the storm. "No, madam," replied he, but neither you nor Miss Mary can remain on deck." The ladies did not oppose an order that seemed more like an entreaty, and returned to the cabin just as a wave, rolling over the stern, shook the compass lights in their sockets. The violence of the wind redoubled, the masts bent under the pressure of sail, and the yacht seemed to rise on the billows. "Brail up the mainsail," cried the captain, "haul in the topsails and jibs." The sailors sprang to their places. The halyards were loosened, the brails drawn down, the jibs taken in with a noise that rose above the storm, and the Duncan, whose smokestack belched forth torrents of black smoke, rolled heavily in the sea. Glenarvan, the Major, Paganel, and Robert gazed with admiration and terror at this struggle with the waves. They clung tightly to the rigging, unable to exchange a word, and watched the flocks of stormy petrels, those melancholy birds of the storm, as they sported in the raging winds. At that moment a piercing sound was heard above the roar of the hurricane. The steam was rapidly escaping, not through the escape valve but through the pipes of the boiler. The alarm whistle sounded with unusual shrillness, the yacht gave a terrible lurch, and Wilson, who was at the helm, was overthrown by an unexpected blow of the wheel. The vessel was in the trough of the sea and no longer manageable. "What is the matter?" cried Captain Mangles, rushing to the stern. "The ship is careening," replied Austin. "Is the rudder unhinged?" To the engine," cried the engineer. The captain rushed down the ladder. A cloud of steam filled the engine room, the pistons were motionless in their cylinders, and the cranks gave no movement to the shaft. The engineer, seeing that all efforts were useless, and fearing for his boilers, had let out the steam through the escape valve. "What has happened?" asked the captain. "The screw is either bent or entangled," replied the engineer. "It will not work." "Is it impossible to free it?" "Impossible at present." To attempt to repair the accident at that moment was out of the question. The screw would not move, and the steam, being no longer effective, had escaped through the valves. The captain was, therefore, forced to rely on his sails and seek the aid of the wind, which had been hitherto his most dangerous enemy. He came on deck, and briefly informing Glenarvan of the situation, begged him to return to the cabin with the others. But the latter wished to remain. "No, my lord," replied Captain Mangles in a firm tone. "I must be alone here with my crew. Go, the ship may be in danger, and the waves would drench you unmercifully." "But we may be of use." Go, my lord, you must. There are times when I am master on board. Retire as I wish." The struggle continued. For John Mangles to express himself so authoritatively, the situation must have been critical. Glenarvan understood that it was his duty to obey. He therefore left the deck, followed by his 3 companions, and joined the ladies in the cabin, who were anxiously awaiting the result of this struggle with the elements. "My brave John is an energetic man," remarked Glenarvan as he entered. Meantime Captain Mangles lost no time in extricating the ship from her perilous situation. He resolved to keep towards the Cape, that he might deviate as little as possible from his prescribed course. It was therefore necessary to brace the sails obliquely to the wind. The topsail was reefed, a kind of foresail rigged on the mainstay, and the helm crowded hard aport. The yacht, which was a staunch and fleet vessel, started like a spirited horse that feels the spur, and proudly breasted the angry billows. The rest of the night was passed in this situation. They hoped that the tempest would abate by break of day. Vain hope. At 8 o'clock in the morning it was still blowing hard, and the wind soon became a hurricane. The captain said nothing, but he trembled for his vessel and those whom she carried. The Duncan now and then gave a fearful lurch, her stanchions cracked, and sometimes the yards of the mainmast struck the crests of the waves. At one moment the crew thought the yacht would not rise again. Already the sailors, hatchet in hand, were rushing to cut away the foreshrouds, when they were violently torn from their fastenings by the blast. The ship righted herself, but without support on the waves, she was tossed about so terribly that the masts threatened to break at their very foundations. She could not long endure such rolling. She was growing weak, and soon her shattered sides and opening seams must give way for the water. Then, impelled by the hurricane, the billows outran her. They leaped over the taffrail, and the whole deck was swept with tremendous violence. Nearing the end. Captain Mangles had but one resource, to rig a storm jib. He succeeded after several hours' labor, But it was not until 3 o'clock in the afternoon that the jib was hauled to the mainstay and set to the wind. With this piece of canvas, the Duncan flew before the wind with inconceivable rapidity. It was necessary to keep up the greatest possible speed, for upon this alone depended her safety. Sometimes, outstripping the waves, she cut them with her slender prow and plunged beneath them like an enormous sea monster, while the water swept her deck from stem to stern. At other times her swiftness barely equaled that of the surges, her rudder lost all power, and she gave terrific lurches that threatened to capsize her. Then, impelled by the hurricane, the billows outran her, they leaped over the taffrail, and the whole deck was swept with tremendous violence. The situation was indeed alarming. The captain would not leave his post for an instant. He was tortured by fears that his impassive face would not betray, and persistently sought to penetrate with his gaze the gathering gloom. And he had good cause for fear. The Duncan, driven out of her course, was running towards the Australian coast with a swiftness that nothing could arrest. He felt, too, as if by instinct, that a strong current was drawing him along. At every moment he feared the shock of a reef upon which the yacht would be dashed into 1,000 pieces, and he calculated that the shore was not more than a dozen miles to leeward. Finally he went in search of Lord Glenarvan, consulted with him in private, explained their actual situation, viewed it with the coolness of a sailor who is ready for any emergency, and ended by saying that he should be obliged perhaps to run the Duncan ashore. "To save those she carries, if possible, my lord," he added. "Very well, Captain," replied Glenarvan. "And Lady Helena and Miss Grant?" "I will inform them only at the last moment, when all hope is gone of keeping at sea. You will tell me." "I will, my lord." Glenarvan returned to the ladies, who, without knowing all the danger, felt it to be imminent. They displayed, however, a noble courage, equal at least to that of their companions. Paganel gave himself up to the most unreasonable theories concerning the direction of atmospheric currents, while the major awaited the end with the indifference of a Mussulman. About 11 o'clock, the hurricane seemed to moderate a little. The heavy mists were gradually dissipated, and through the openings the captain could see a low land at least 6 miles to leeward. He steered directly for it. Huge waves rolled to a prodigious height, and he knew that they must have a firm point of support to reach such an elevation. "There are sandbars here," said he to Tom Austin. "That is my opinion," replied the mate. "We are in the hands of God," continued the captain. "If he does not himself guide the Duncan over the bar, we are lost. It is high tide now, Captain, perhaps we may do it. But see the fury of those waves, what ship could resist them? God help us, my friend." Meantime the Duncan dashed towards the shore with terrible swiftness. Soon she was only 2 miles from the sandbars. The mist still continued to conceal the land. Nevertheless, Captain Mangles thought he perceived, beyond this foaming barrier, a tranquil haven, where the Duncan would be in comparative safety. But how to reach it? He called the passengers on deck, for he did not wish, when the hour of shipwreck had come, that they should be confined in the cabin. Glenarvan and his companions gazed at the awful sea. Mary Grant grew pale. "John," said Glenarvan in a low tone to the young captain, "I will try to save my wife, or will perish with her. Do you take charge of Miss Grant?" "Oily influences." "Yes, your lordship," was the prompt reply. The Duncan was now only a few cable lengths from the sandbars. As it was high tide, there would doubtless have been sufficient water to enable the yacht to cross these dangerous shoals, but the enormous waves upon which she rose and fell would infallibly have wrecked her. Was there then any means of allaying these billows, of calming this tumultuous sea? A sudden idea occurred to the captain. "The oil," cried he, "pour on oil, men, pour on oil." These words were quickly understood by all the crew. They were about to employ a method that sometimes succeeds. The fury of the sea can often be appeased by covering it with a sheet of oil, which floats on the surface and destroys the shock of the waters. The effect is instantaneous but transient. As soon as a ship has crossed this treacherous sea, it redoubles its fury, and woe to those who would venture to follow. The barrels containing the supply of seal oil were hoisted into the forecastle by the crew, to whom the danger gave new strength. Here they were stove in with a blow of the hatchet, and suspended over the starboard rattlings. "Hold on," cried the captain, waiting for the favorable moment. In a few seconds the yacht reached the entrance to the pass, which was barred by a terrible line of foam. "Let go!" cried the young captain. The barrels were inverted, and from their sides streamed floods of oil. Immediately, the unctuous liquid leveled the foaming surface of the sea, and the Duncan sailed on calm waters, and was soon in a quiet harbor beyond the terrible sandbars. And then the ocean, released from its fetters, bounded after its escaped prey with indescribable fury. "Let go!" cried the young captain. The barrels were inverted, and from their sides streamed floods of oil. Chapter 30. A hospitable colonist. The captain's first care was to secure anchorage. He moored the vessel in 5 fathoms of water. The bottom was good, a hard gravel, affording an excellent hold. There was no danger of drifting, or of stranding at low tide. The Duncan, after so many hours of peril, was now in a sort of creek sheltered by a high promontory from the fury of the wind. Lord Glenarvan shook the hand of the young captain, saying, "Thanks, John." And Captain Mangles felt himself fully rewarded by these simple words. Glenarvan kept to himself the secret of his anguish, and neither Lady Helena, Mary Grant, nor Robert suspected the magnitude of the perils they had just escaped. One important point remained to be settled. On what part of the coast had the Duncan been cast by the storm? How could she regain her prescribed course? How far were they from Cape Bernouilli? Such were the first questions addressed to the captain, who at once took his bearings and noted his observations on the map. The Duncan had not deviated very far from her route. She was at Cape Catastrophe, on the southern coast of Australia, not 300 miles from Cape Bernouilli. But could the Duncan's injuries be repaired? This was the question to decide. The captain wished to know the extent of the damage. It was discovered, by diving, that a flange of the screw was bent and came in contact with the stern post. Hence it was impossible for the screw to rotate. This injury was considered serious enough to necessitate going into dry dock, which of course could not be done in their present locality.